dangerous.
Which may be a good moment to ask you about just how long your friendship with Harold was.
Well, we met in 1947, you see, in what would be the American equivalent of grade 11. And
but actually you met before then.
Yes, we did. We met during the war, that's true. When we were about 12 or 14, the bombing was going on, so they evacuated hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million children out of the bigger cities. And Harold went to a place in Cornwall at one stage. We were always being shunted about to what people thought were safe areas. I went to a town, King's Lynn, because they said it was a safe area, and we were bombed for 57 consecutive nights. And that's all right. That's why I learned the power of prayer. I was doing terribly badly in the exams, and the Germans used to come and bomb us every night. They were very punctual. They'd arrive at 8 o'clock. The Germans are very punctual. Yes. And they'd come in below the radar. Most of their bombers were in Russia by that time. It was the summer of 41. Mm-hmm. But they'd come in under the radar. I think they just used this little town, King's Lynn, as a practice.
Yeah.
Target practice. They'd come in and we'd say, "Come on, Henry, the Germans is coming." And I'd done terribly badly in the exams at high school, so I didn't realise that work was expected. And I thought, what are my parents going to say? Oh my goodness, and they said, "Henry, come on, hurry up, finish them prayers." My mother would say, "You've got to say your prayers every night." And every night I'd tell them and say, "Please God, look after Mummy and Daddy and the cat and all my brothers and sisters." Then I had a great idea. I said, "Oh, and God, while we're at it, I know you're awfully busy with the war and everything. If you could help me with the exams, I'd be awfully grateful." And that night, the Germans dropped 419 incendiary bombs on the school. And burnt the first 3 floors right off. So exams were cancelled. So I've always believed in the power of prayer.
My God, you did that?
Yes, we did. And then we went round to different places. I bumped into Harold in Cornwall, Gorenhaven. He told me this marvellous story. He said to me, he was only about 12 himself. And he said, and I was watching, and there was a French light machine gun. I said, "I know it's a Hotchkiss," because little boys know all about that sort of thing. Yeah. He said, and 2 Hurricanes chased a German Messerschmitt up the beach during the Battle of Britain, this was. And they came back, and there was only 1 Hurricane left. And they went round again, and then there were no Hurricanes left, he said. And that sort of thing, we grew up in this. The point I'm trying to make in this roundabout way of being really patient is that when people talk about Pinter as a political writer, they talk about it as if it's some intellectually conceived idea or approach to life. That isn't the case at all. He was a political liver, and we lived politics. We didn't just read about it. And at the end of the war, we had to come to this kind of decision that were we going to be swamped by the events of the war, the increasing knowledge of the huge massacres in Eastern Europe, not just the Holocaust, not just the millions who died in Auschwitz and Treblinka, all that sort of thing. No, further east in the Ukraine, in Belarus, millions and millions. Were we going to be swamped by those political events? Were we going to be swamped by the Cold War and above all by the explosion of the atomic bomb, which we thought was going to be the end of us? None of us, we were a gang, about 6 of us went around together. We had no idea that we were going to survive, have any children, so we put all the political issues to one side. Although we were being chased around Hackney by newly released fascists who had been interned during the war, been released after the war, they started chasing Jews like us, 4 Jews, 2 non-Jews in our sort of group. Mm-hmm. And so we lived politics. Yeah. And we didn't have to say we were political. And that's why Harold, I think, got so angry. When people said, "Are you political?" He said, "What are you talking about?" when he was writing to begin with.
It was a stupid remark, wasn't it?
Irrelevance.
It was an irrelevance.
Yeah.
The reason I wasn't looking at the book because I was bored. I was looking at the book because the piece about his evacuation is in the book, and there's a little moment where one of the boys that he was evacuated with, someone comes to the school and tells this boy in Harold's class, aged 9, that the previous night his parents had been killed in a raid in London, and Harold and others are watching this boy having his life destroyed. You know, the war, you could be evacuated, but the war was still there.
Absolutely.
And the separation from his parents and the fact that death was even among them down there in Cornwall where they were supposed to be safe. And then that night in London when there was an incendiary bomb in the garden, and the tree that Harold used to climb and play under was ablaze. He looked out of the window and his own tree was on fire. I mean, how could someone with a poetic imagination and a lust for life not be deeply, deeply scarred and impressed by this incredible background, I mean, or foreground? I mean, it's all happening right there.
How precarious everything is, which figures so heavily.
Exactly. The
The
stakes are
uncertainty.
always that high. It's life and death always.
All those themes figure so heavily.
Exactly.
Yes, and
From the
Kafka,
very get-go, from
Yeah.
the very start.
you know, Kafka, he loved Kafka, but we'd lived Kafka.
Yeah.
The knock on the door, what was going on behind the door, what was going on, you know.
And sex, because there's also a reference in the piece about evacuees, where at the age of 12 he's in a Morrison shelter, fondling a lovely girl.
Yes.
So sex and bombs and death and all of that is all happening at puberty.
Yeah.
Lucky sod, my God.
But I have to say this, that we lived in this strange little world in which, within the proletarian heart of the East End, we swam like there were 4 Jewish boys and 2 non-Jewish, but we didn't really have a vocabulary for sexual behaviour. So one of the interesting aspects of Harold's plays, like for example The Homecoming, the prime example, we had to borrow the language of what you might call the proletariat, whose sexual relations were hardly subtle. You know, no, they spoke quite differently and had different expectations. I didn't know the boys were different from girls till about 11, when what I thought was a deformed baby girl was born in the house I was evacuated to. That's how innocent we were. But then around us, they actually did have a vocabulary, and that was how we thought about girls. And when we actually got to have what is laughingly known as relationships with real women, we found all that didn't work at all. And then and that was all the thing. But we learnt this language, and Harold, better than anyone, there's that wonderful poems and The Homecoming, where the language and the attitude to women is so extraordinary. And in The Homecoming, this strange mixture of desire and hatred and loathing and so forth.
It's impossible not to notice that, particularly the early plays, there's a tremendous pull between, if you like, an archetypal view of women as sexually available, not to say an aspect of prostitution, because there are many references to prostitutes and so forth, but also a sort of longing for love, for romance, for almost a kind of early marriage, a sort of idealization.
Yeah.
What do you think that tension in where did that? Are you a Freudian about it? Do you think it was because he was so attached to his mother that he felt ashamed of his sexual urges, which were so strong so early?
Well, I don't know about it.
5 o'clock in the morning, some days.
Well, if you're going to be
Very bad
flippant,
joke.
I think I'll leave now. This is desperately
No, the
important
question was
subject.
serious, and I want you to answer.
Oh dear. But I think it is that I think there was a gap between the behaviour that was expected as we took these girls out to the park. By the time he was 13, Harold was way beyond the park. He was in the park. There were no cars, by the way. That's a very important thing. There was nowhere to take a girl, unlike, nowhere to take a girl to make love to except under a bloody bramble bush somewhere.
Or the canal.
Or the canal. Most of the days, it was the kind of borrowed phrase that these young men, that's us, would use is, without causing offence to our patrons, I must lapse from the language of polite usage for a moment, with regret, of course. But the favourite
That's
kind
why
of...
we have editors.
That's why we have... Thank goodness for editors. Oh, if only the Lord
Now they
Chamberlain...
can't edit it because I said that.
Thank you, Frank. Do tell me when you've had the last word. But the thing is, that the kind of remark that the young men would say to each other, they knew someone had gone out with a girl, they'd say, this is what one's sexual expectations were in 1948 or 9. Did you get a tit out? You see, which is both naive and humble and gross and embarrassing. And it's the language of the proletariat.